Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, whichever one is applicable. I bring you greetings from Ghana. Happy New Year to all of you. It's great to see all of you here. Undoubtedly, it is a privilege for me to interact with some of the world's best teachers and educators attending this virtual forum. Let me start first of all by expressing my sincere gratitude to the organizing committee for the kind invitation for me to share my experience in teaching in less endowed schools in Ghana, at least in the last 2 decades. I am incredibly humbled by the honor bestowed on me and for that matter, the Ghana National Association of Teachers, NAT, a professional organization that I belong to. My name is Richard Boni, a teacher by profession and working with Behaviorism Senior High Technical School, a community-based school in Ghana. I am also a resource person for the Ghana National Association of Teachers, NAT, and the Ghana Association of Science Teachers, GAST, where I am engaged in training basic school teachers across the country. Today, we are here to share some thoughts on a topic, quote unquote, demystifying the teaching of science in less endowed schools, using inquiry-based approach and reflective practices. Firstly, we will briefly talk about the importance of some psychological concepts and frameworks underlining the teaching of science to enhance meaningful appreciation of concepts being taught in our classrooms. Then we'll look at the use of inquiry-based learning approach in our delivery. Finally, we'll look at the essence of reflective practices in our teaching to give a true meaning to the use of the inquiry-based learning approach. Ladies and gentlemen, the psychological frameworks of behaviorism, constructivism, and cognitivism cannot be underestimated in our classroom works. For instance, in a typical constructivist science classroom, learning is based on the premise that knowledge is created rather than acquired. Constructivism is an epistemology which focuses on the role of the learner in the personal construction of knowledge. Von Clausewitz, 1987. Excuse me. Learning is viewed as an adaptive process where the learner's existing knowledge is modified in response to perturbations which arise from both personal and social interactions. Whitley, 1991. Constructivists believe that what we know of the real world stems from the interpretations of our experiences. They know that the mind filters inputs from the world to produce its own unique reality. Students therefore actively construct their own knowledge from their personal experiences with others and the environment. So therefore, what is the goal of the constructivist approach? The goal of instruction in constructivism is not to ensure that individuals know particular facts, but rather they can elaborate and interpret information. The teacher is a facilitator in a constructivist classroom. He guides learners to create the appropriate knowledge. He provides meaningful context to students, ensuring that information is presented in different ways to suit different learners, depending on their ability groupings. Effective learning can only occur when individuals construct their own understandings. From the above framework, it is important to look at a very critical pedagogical approach which places the learner at the center of the learning process in creating knowledge for himself, and that is the inquiry-based learning approach. Now, why do we have to opt for the inquiry-based approach? Ladies and gentlemen, after graduating from the University of Cape Coast, where I had my first degree, I set out to explore further on this inquiry-based approach. And I adopted the use of the inquiry-based learning in the teaching of chemistry, and for that matter, science in general, in the typical rural community where I started teaching and currently teaching as well. I got so excited with the use of the inquiry-based strategy after discovering different phases of frameworks in the use of the inquiry-based learning approach. It has been argued that inquiry-based teaching methods are the best path to achieving scientific literacy because they provide students with the opportunity to discuss and debate scientific ideas. This is based on work done by American Association for the Advancement of Science, 1993. Surveys of instructional practices suggest that inquiry-based scientific investigations have been widely embraced in college biology laboratory curricula over the past decade, reportedly varying from less than 10% to almost 80% of laboratory classrooms of universities in the US. And this is based on the work done by Sandberg and Armstrong, 1992, Sandberg, Armstrong, and Richardson, 2005. My students and I often go through the inquiry-based learning, which places the learner's questions, ideas, and observations at the center of the learning experience. Through inquiry-based learning, my students are engaged in investigations in which they identify problems, they ask questions, they propose solutions, they design procedures, collect and organize data, and also draw conclusions. Raising questions and working towards looking for solutions to the questions have become very important components of the teaching that embraces inquiry-based learning for my students. Scaffolding strategies are always structured in a way that promotes student-centered and inquiry-based learning. It has always been evidently clear that when the participating inquiry-based learning approach is introduced within the same student groups, a significant improvements are observed where the students obtain better interactions and integrative friendships among themselves. As a result, the students are able to cope with reasonable explanations. Scadimelia 2002 argues for the need for teachers to establish classroom culture where ideas are respectfully challenged, tested, redefined, and viewed as improvable. He further notes that the culture in the classroom should be one that allows moving children from one position of wondering to a position of understanding and further questioning. Ladies and gentlemen, I want us to look at the phases or the frameworks of IBL. Several phases or frameworks of the inquiry-based learning approach have been identified by research findings. And of course, if you Google, you check on the internet, you will notice that there are several phases or frameworks that are associated with the inquiry-based approach. Let me therefore share with you the one that best works for myself and my students. There are 5 major stages that are associated with the IBL approach that I use with my students. And I picked this from www.inquiry.uicuc.edu. There are 5 major stages that are associated with the inquiry-based approach that I use with my students, and this involve 1. Asking questions, investigating, creating knowledge, discussing, and then adopting the reflective approach. These are the 5 major stages that are associated. So let's go through them one by one. And what do we mean by asking questions? So we said the first and most important stage in the inquiry-based approach is by asking questions. And this is done by way of students formulating their own questions. Of course, in order not to allow the students to get confused, the teacher can guide them, can give them some introductory talks, and the teacher can also help them by stimulating them. Once you stimulate the students, you are able to help the student by directing them to come out with relevant questions. Once those questions are put up, more or less, those questions now act more or less like a hypothesis for which the students are actually going to develop. Then they now set out to investigate those questions that they put out there. So students collect information, they exploit resources, and they experiment further. And this is done through their investigation process. In so doing, they get to the next stage where they create knowledge for themselves. And what happens here? Students merge information and make links to create new knowledge. Once this is done, they move to the next stage, which is the discussion. Of course, this is a very critical stage where we have students with various ability groupings. So students share their ideas with each other, they compare notes, discuss conclusions, and share experiences that they acquired in the course of doing their work. And then they get to the last stage, which is the reflective stage. They reflect. Of course, this is done by both the teacher and the students. The teacher and the students take time to look back at the concepts encountered. They try to synthesize and engage further planning. And this is a very crucial stage for all teachers as far as the inquiry-based approach is concerned, because that is the stage by which you look at what you actually did, because in some cases you end up not doing what is right. So by adopting the reflective approach in the inquiry-based process, you are able to, um, as it were, track whatever you have done, and then in a subsequent work that you'll be doing, you can correct your mistakes. Inquiry-based learning is seen as a systematic process which begins with framing the investigation by identifying the questions to be answered. This is then followed by designing the investigation, collecting and presenting data. The data is then analyzed and the results interpreted. Ladies and gentlemen, there are several challenges that are associated with the inquiry-based approach. Myself, my students have identified 4 major challenges that we want to share with you. In spite of the appreciable success story associated with the inquiry-based learning, there are a number of challenges that have been identified while using this pedagogical strategy. So those 4 challenges are: 1, motivation; 2, accessibility of investigation techniques; 3, background or theoretical knowledge; and 4, practical constraints in the school environment. Now let's take them one by one. What do we make of the motivation being a challenge? For students to engage in inquiry in a way that can contribute to meaningful learning, they must be sufficiently motivated, and it's so basic that we all appreciate that. To foster learning, motivation becomes crucial in generating interest in the investigation in the inquiry process. When students are not sufficiently motivated or are not motivated by legitimate interest, they either fail to participate in inquiry activities, and we all know that, and even sometimes they get filtered out along the line. What do you make of the accessibility of investigation techniques as a challenge? For students to engage in inquiry, they must know how to perform the task that their investigation requires. They must understand the goals of these practices, and they must be able to interpret the results. Scientific investigation techniques such as data collection and analysis can be complicated and typically require a level of precision and care that are not required of students in their everyday experiences. Yes, these are things that students don't normally use in their everyday experiences, but once they get to the school and they adopt the inquiry-based approach, they are confronted with this. If students are not able to master these techniques, then they cannot conduct investigations that yield meaningful results. This challenge has become a major headache among students from basic schools, especially those from the rural areas, over the years. They are admitted with very challenging grades in mathematics from basic schools, with huge challenges, and often struggle with data computation and analysis when confronted with the IBL task. Now, what about the background or the theoretical knowledge that they're supposed to have? The formulation of research questions, the development of a research plan, data collection, analysis, and interpretation of data all require science content knowledge. In designing inquiry-based learning, the challenge is providing opportunities for learners to both develop and apply that scientific understanding. If students lack this knowledge and the opportunity to develop it, then they will be unable to complete meaningful investigations. The interesting thing in the curriculum, at least on our part of the world here, is the spiral focus on exposing students to the scientific knowledge and processes at all levels in graduation, which unfortunately is treated as a mere regurgitated concepts at the basic schools through rote memorization, where students don't seem to appreciate its importance. Yes, you ask students, what do they make of the scientific process? Students are able to tell you the scientific process and all of that. Then you go further, asking them to tell you what do they mean by that. A child tells you, oh, yes, identification of a problem, experimentation, and hypothesis, and all of that. You ask them to give you, further details, and they are unable to do that. Practical constraints of the learning context as a challenge. What do we make of that? The activities associated with inquiry-based learning must fit within the practical constraints of the learning environment, such as the restrictions imposed by available resources. Although this challenge may not have the same theoretical importance as the other three stated above for advancing our understanding of the learning sciences, it has enormous practical implications for design. A failure to work within the available concepts or fit within the existing schedule in a school could result in failure of the design or hypothesis at stake. Therefore, meeting the constraints of the environment is a critical consideration in design that must be considered alongside learning needs in the design of tasks. However, the lack or inadequate learning resources often present major difficulties in the learning context, and this is a major challenge in most rural communities in Ghana. Let me give you an example here. Ghana is confronted with illegal mining, popularly known as galamsey, in our context. Yes, students are aware that people do this illegal mining where they release lead and all of that is poisonous lead into the water bodies, and they are aware of that. They come to the school system, you stimulate them, they are able to ask relevant questions that are related to this illegal mining. You ask them to bring sample of water from the various communities so that you can investigate further and see if there is lead content in the water in doing all of this. Now, the challenge you have here is that even though you are curious, you are stimulating the students for them to appreciate by finding solutions to the questions that they are asking as to the effects of the illegal mining. You are confronted with um, resource constraints. You don't have the facilities. But because you are bent on providing the answers for this student, helping them to find answers, what you have to do is to go further. You find out from other schools, you get the resources. So you don't have it, but because you want to really help your students to find answers, you go extra mile to get the resources, bring them to your school system so that you can take your students through that to find answers to such a challenge. Notwithstanding the challenges using the IBL, teachers can make significant impact with the IBL by using the Thorndike's laws on learning, such as the law of effects, the law of exercise, and the law of readiness. And this is something so basic we all studied in our education classrooms. Students learn by trial and error, and so teachers need to be patient with students. And that is very critical as we adopt the inquiry-based approach. We don't rush students, you take your time for the students to go through the process and acquire all the needed concepts. More time is needed for practice. Yes, you don't rush, you take your time and let the students go through the stages so that they can acquire all the necessary concepts. Motivation is key to learning. Teachers must observe the effects of their methods on students and change if necessary. Yes, you recall me stating earlier that there's a critical stage in the inquiry-based approach, which is the reflective approach. Yes, once you are able to actually monitor what students do critically, you would have noticed that a strategy that probably you were using might not be working for all students. And if you do proper reflection, you would have adopted a strategy in changing your teaching methods as you go ahead. And we must also recognize the fact that rewards and punishments also do affect learning. Ladies and gentlemen, the final stage in our inquiry-based learning is reflection, as I mentioned earlier, which is the process of describing, critiquing, evaluating, and discussing the whole inquiry cycle or a specific phase. Reflective practice is the ability to reflect on one's actions so as to engage in a process of continuous learning. It involves paying critical attention to the practical values and theories which inform everyday actions. by examining practice reflectively and reflexively, leading to developmental insights. This was backed by both in 2010. The reflection stage is an inner discussion or an inquiry activity with a view to engaging in further investigations. Reflection involves linking a current experience to previous learnings. Reflective thinking helps learners develop higher order thinking skills by prompting them to relate new knowledge to prior understanding. Reflection on any experience can be done before, during, and after a task or a design. Reflection can be done through oral reflections, videotaping of your task, written logs, letting another colleague observe you, and observing others to strengthen what you do. And of course, this comes with some ethical issues, but we must understand why we are doing this. If you are asking a colleague to videotape you, or you want to go and videotape a colleague, yes, the colleague must understand that probably there's something you want to learn from him. There's an approach. Probably he is better, he's well placed in adopting that strategy in delivering. So you want to learn that from him. So you go out there and go and videotape what he's doing in class, so that you bring that to whatever you are doing. Your colleague must understand why you are doing that, so that it doesn't bring a struggle as far as ethical issues are concerned in the teaching profession. This, together with the other phases of the inquiry-based learning strategy, helps in getting the best out of the teacher and his students. In conclusion, inasmuch as there are challenges associated with the way we teach our students because of diversity in their background, invariant teachers must be gradually moving towards reflective practice. For example, where methodology is varied to benefit all students in the student-centered approach, as seen in the inquiry-based learning. Because we recognize the fact that the inquiry-based learning is a way of shifting the focus from the teacher to the learner. Good. This has been part of my strategies in getting the best out of my students in a typical less endowed schools with a number of students with great diversity. And I can say this with all humility. There are a number of students who have passed through my hands who had adopted these strategies. Some of them are actually even pursuing their PhD. And I'm so humbled to actually see the kind of impact that they are making out there, even though they came to our schools with very difficult background. But at least they are out there making impacts on the world. And we are so humbled to actually notice that. It's been an honor, ladies and gentlemen, to be among such accomplished individuals and to be able to present my humble perspectives before you. I thank you all for doing the listening, and have a good day. Bye-bye.